Steve said, we'll be ending our time with each other in a brainstorming and discussion period. It's not just questions. I certainly want to hear your ideas. I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've been hearing across the country where people are doing things in terms of cutting back at the same time of re-engineering. If I do my job today, I'm going to give you lots of ideas. They probably all won't work for you. The idea is to give enough insight and enough ideas that you can pick those that make the greatest sense to you. The one thing that is definitely true, I have the easy job. I only have to say it, and you have to do it. So I want you to put all of the ideas through your reality screen and to see if we can all leave with something that will be useful to everyone. What I'm really pleased about is it appears that we have so many people attending. Some of them are leaders, some of them are frontline staff, and best of all, we have in a number of different local areas, both leaders and frontline staff joining together. That means that after the webinar, people will be able to get together and to talk some about what makes sense and how they can move forward. I just noticed in the chat bar that some people are having a little hard time hearing. Maybe what I will do is I'll turn up my my sound, and you might want to make sure that you also turn up your sound as well. So, having said that, let's dig in. The next thing that we want to look at is the cruel the economy's tough, the unemployment rate is high. We as a system have continued to provide great performance with the limited resources we've been given, but people are still expecting more. Now you would think with these first four items that would mean that we would have more money. But what the simple truth is they keep giving us less. I don't know why we're getting less. Maybe it's that people don't see us as relevant. Maybe it's the political times that we live in. But here's the simple truth. Everybody is confronting a huge reality in terms of reduced resources. And what that means is that we're going to have to figure out a way to cope. So let's just say right now, life is unfair. So consequently, here's the truth. What I would like for everyone to do right now, if you're in the room with someone, is to give them a hug. If you're not in the room with someone, give them a virtual hug. Because the simple truth is, life is unfair. We are not getting enough resources, but it's like Texas Hold'em. We've been dealt this hand, and now we have to figure out how to play them most effectively. Beginning July of this year. We'll have a chance to see how much reduction you've experienced, but the first question is this the last reduction we will have, or will there be further reductions in the future? This is a very important question, because if you believe that really we've confronted all the reduction in resources that we have, then all we have to do is just plug the dike. It means that we can simply just sort of paperclip, glue, do a few things to make it better. But if we believe that this is going to be a continued downward slide in terms of resources, then we're going to have to reconceive the way we do our work. The simple truth is that as we begin to think some about reconceiving our work, we need to think some about how much change are we ready to have. Because if we just cut back, we may end up being less of what we should have no longer been anyway. And so consequently, this is a session about re-engineering. Now, before we move forward, let's move to the first poll question. Steve, could you ask people the first poll question for us? We want to explore exactly how much your budget was reduced this program year. And you'll notice that there's a number of choices there. Not at all, So let's see the results as they're coming in. Nationally, most local areas experienced about a 20% cut. We'll see what was true with Illinois here. Wow, look at all of the people who don't know. Um, I will say to you, don't know is an interesting response, and please don't hear that as a blame comment. But one of the things we'll be doing throughout this particular session is talking some about big change items. And if you're on the front line and you don't know the budgetary situation, then that's really sort of a problem, because you have to know exactly what's happening to resources so you can be involved in the change. Wow, it looks like most of you lost more than 20%. That's a very, very large amount. That's like, over 1/5. This is, of course, made even worse by the fact that we had the ARA funding and the stimulus funding, which caused us to have this huge spike in resources and set lots of expectations that we had lots of money for training. And what that means is that this drop seems to be even worse than it was. But actually, we're in a worse situation now than when Steve, let's clear that poll. Let's ask one more question before we move forward. If we could look at the next one. Because what we want to find out is what happened in your agency or organization as a result of these budgetary cutbacks. Did you reduce or lay off frontline staff? Reduction would mean not filling positions, for example. Did you do so with management staff? Did you have to close facilities? Did you reduce funding for training? Or did you make significant changes in streamlined policies and procedures? Or did you do something else? You can click more than one choice if you wish to do so. Wow. Look at all of the reduction in frontline staff. 3/4 of you had that experience. Boy, I bet the customers are feeling a difference on that, but even more so, I bet the frontline staff are feeling really pressured by all these cutbacks. Looks like we about that must be expended on training. That must be particularly tough. Any other votes coming in here? For those of you who had other cost-reducing steps, I'll be anxious to hear later what exactly you did. But the one I want to highlight for just a moment is streamlining policies, procedures, and processes. And again, it's easy for me to say, but I think the result of that particular poll should be 100%, because I do not believe it is possible to have a reduction in staff and to have a reduction in resources and to keep all of the processes the same. So Steve, let's clear that poll question and to move on to talking some about the importance of re-engineering. The concept of re-engineering while cutting back is pretty tough, because what it really means is that we have to expend staff time when there's actually fewer staff and figuring out how to do something different. Leadership is exceptionally important here. And for those of you who are leaders in the room, I know all of this is obvious, but there's about 3 or 4 things that we have to remember about leadership in hard times. First of all, no one wants to work for a wimp, which means that they want to ensure that work is distributed equitably, because while fair always means that everybody is working hard, it becomes even more important in a time when there are fewer staff. The whole organization must feel like they're doing something about the situation and not just reacting, but actually responding. That means that it's been my experience that in general, we have to make sure that we announce a redesign process at the time of cutback. We need to begin to pull staff together to examine everything we do. We're going to be talking some about lean manufacturing and about doing process mapping, because one of the things that most needs to be done is for all staff to get together to figure out how they're going to cope and survive in not only hard times, but when there's fewer resources available. One of the things that we want to make sure we do is that we keep busy at making it better. This may be a little klutzy example, but the example I like to give on this, and some of you might remember this show, I'll certainly show my age group here. How many of you remember the Waltons? Well, here's the thing about the Waltons, that it was a show that took place in the hills of Virginia. Since I was born in Kentucky, I always thought it was my kin. And here's the story I'd like to tell about it in time. Went up to the mountains to find Jim Bob. This left all the women behind. And for those of you who remember the show, Grandma was quite a feisty old person. And so all of the women are crying and feeling bad. And Grandma looks at them and says, "Let's scrub floors." Well, I don't know if the example's clear or not, but we need to scrub floors. We do not just need to keep being busy. We would, in fact, need to be busy about doing something about the situation. Because if staff are not busy about improving the situation, they will spend a lot of time in thinking about how bad they feel about the situation. We must be open to changing everything we can and recognizing we can't do everything that we did in the past. One of the proofs is most staff now will have a quart in a pint jar. What's most important is that the organization defines what's in the pint. If you do not define what's in the pint, then every staff will decide individually as to what's most important. No one will be able to do everything that they did, and they'll simply run out of time. One of the things we also need to do is to define the pint, because simply put, that if you do not define it, some staff will hold on to things that we can no longer do. I'd like to tell you a quick story that may or may not be applicable to you. In New York, a couple of years ago, they no paper files existed in the workforce system. And what happened is about 3 months after they announced that change, I was visiting a one-stop center, and I looked over, and here was a case manager adjusting her paper files. So I went over, and I said, hey, did you know that they changed the policy where you no longer have to do paper files? Because you know how it is. Sometimes frontline staff are the last to hear. She looked up at me and she said, "Greg, I know they said that." I said, "Well, then why do you have paper files?" She said, "Well, there's two reasons. First of all, you never know when they're going to change their mind. And second of all, I like paper files." Well, here's the simple truth. For many staff, breaking up is hard to do. Many staff do not like the way things are going, but they actually sometimes act as though they don't want to change a thing. What we're going to have to think through is what is it we can actually subtract. And if you'll join me, I'd like to move you forward on a couple of slides here and to talk some about redesigning and very familiar with lean manufacturing. Lean manufacturing is about eliminating waste and adding value. And so what we want to talk some about is how we can eliminate waste through subtraction. And one of the things we need to do is to remove the bureaucratic ways we've always done things. Um, to a large degree, a lot of people believe that things are the law that may or may not be actually the law. I think you would probably agree with me that sometimes if you do something the same way long enough, it becomes the law, whether it's the law or not. I always like when I go to organizations and I say, well, why do we do that? And they say, because it's the law. Well, have you ever noticed a lot of people who say it's the law has never read the law? One of the things we must do is to make sure that we comply, but that we comply in such a way as to not create extra process steps for us. To a large degree, organizations are a collection of everything that was learned in the past. Staff training entry process, many of the process steps actually did not begin with the Workforce Investment Act, but actually began with the Job Training Partnership Act. This idea of calling every participant after they've exited the program may or may not help performance, but is actually rooted in the JTPA practice of needing to call participants to verify employment before we began to use wage records. What organizations always do is to implement what they believe has been proven to be successful for them in the past. And a lot of the change imperative here is to have new organizational learning about what might be successful in the future. So we really need to take a look at all of the activities that we undertake, and we need to make sure that while we achieve performance, that we're not spending lots of time on things that don't work. Now, you can have your own opinion on this, but I would like to spend a little bit more time on these post-exit calls. First of all, many staff, when they're attempting to call, show that for every 10 calls made, fewer than 2 actually make connection. Caller ID may be the worst thing that ever happened to us. But no matter what, that even if we were successful in returning calls and to the point where finally we reach people, the national data shows that that kind of verification of employment at most only adds 1 to 2% for performance. So is it really worth all of the staff time to make those calls if in fact most performance is really achieved through the wage records? You don't have to agree with that particular comment, but it's the kind of question we have to ask about what is it that we continue to need to do. So the first thing that probably many organizations will want to consider is the development of a procedures manual. Now, some of you are probably saying, well, Greg, you just said that we need to get rid of some of the paperwork and all of those kinds of things. Why in the world should we spend time on developing a procedures manual? Because the only way that I know to bring about fundamental change in an organization is to have a mutual agreement across all staff about how customers are going to be served. I have worked with organizations that literally have no customer flow charts and actually have no procedures, or if they have a procedures manual, they haven't read it or used it in many, many different years. What we want to do is to make our procedures explicit so that staff know exactly what it is that they need to do and exactly what they don't need to do. Most staff people do a wonderful job, but many people doing a wonderful job in a non-concerted kind of way does not lead to the best results. So one of the things that we need to do is to map the process, and we need to make sure the process is right. I'll never forget, I went to one organization, and the first thing I asked people to do is to bring their flow chart. Well, all these people brought flow charts, and by the way, some people brought the different flow charts for the same program, for the same staff. The meeting was interesting because the first 20 minutes was about, is that our flow chart? I didn't know we had a flow chart. Well, my flow chart's not like that. So consequently, we need to make sure we're all singing from the same hymn book. And then, after we begin to put the procedures together, we might want to have a subtraction contest. What forms do staff believe we can eliminate? What steps do we believe we can eliminate? What policy do we believe we can change? Because the first step to coping and doing more and becoming more with less is to find out what no longer needs to be eliminated, because without getting rid of some things, then you have no time to be able to do new things. The first rule of eliminating waste is if we don't have to do it, then don't do it. If we have to do it because of regulation, because of law, then we need to minimize it, and we have to comply without getting busted. So we're going to define waste as any step that does not add value to the desired outcome. And wherever waste exists, then it should be eliminated, simplified, or reduced. We'll talk some about value in a moment, but simply put, value is when the customer perceives value and when it helps us achieve our performance. So any step that does not add perceived value for the customer or does not help us achieve performance is waste. Now, as we mentioned earlier, some waste we have to do. Many of the rules and regulations for our programs actually build in waste into our process. All of the documentation that's required for entering our programs is required waste. Case, the situation is many wasteful items have to be done, but we need to make sure we don't go overboard and do more than we need to do. The first step is to make sure that it's actually required. By the way, sometimes what is required is not required by federal law, it's not even required by state law, but it's required by local policy that was written a long time ago, when there was a very different time. And so in many cases, we need to figure out who's causing the waste. Is it us locally? Is it state policy? Is it federal policy? And we need to make sure that we're not using organizational lore to make that particular decision. So that's the first thing we need to do, is to make sure that it's absolutely required. We need to ask 3 questions about every step in our process. So as you put your procedures manual together and we begin to map the processes, we need to ask 3 specific questions. Do we have to? And if we have to, we have to, but don't go overboard. Do we want to? And by the way, some of the things we want to, we should do, even if it is not required, but we must make sure. And as you map your process and you begin to list all of the various steps, those 3 questions should be asked about every step. Value is interesting because value is valuable if the customer perceives it to be valuable, and it helps us achieve our performance. So what does add value? Well, here's the first thing. Staff assistance does add value, and we will discuss later how even in these tight times when staff are being reduced, by redeploying staff, more and more organizations are moving to one-on-one service delivery as the first contact for customers. Because the ultimate question for customers is, what did I get because I came to the office that I could not get online? Customers appreciate staff assistance that provides customized services in relationship to their specific needs. And oftentimes, when people begin in the resource area and what we call universal core services, they do not perceive that they receive customized assistance. And if all they're going to do is to sit at a computer that they could have done so at home, what is it that they really received? Sometimes when I visit one-stop centers across the country, I ask people outside the center, how was it for you? A job referral is tangible. Of course, the ITA, the individual training account voucher, is a tangible. Support services are tangible. But we need to make sure that every step people take something away. When people come to an orientation meeting, what do they take away? Just information? Well, that's not very tangible. So we need to pump tangibility into each process step. Some of you may or may not agree with this last statement, but what really adds value is when people get a good job. One of the reasons why on-the-job training needs to be made a successful program is because it is a staff-assisted, customized, tangible product outcome that provides all four ways that customers perceive value. With the individual training account, they get staff assistance, customization, and tangibility, but then they have to hope they get a job after training. So as we're going through our process mapping, not only do we want to eliminate waste, but we want to find out how can we infuse value in each process step. And getting people attached to the labor market. So we've been referring to mapping your customer flow for the purpose of streamlining your process. What this is a simple step-by-step about how customers are served as they enter your organization, as they enter your center, or they enter your program. And what you want to do is to get it all up on a board so that all frontline staff and all leadership can look at it so you can begin to ask some hard questions. So there's a number of things that you want to do as you're going through your process mapping here. I'd like to spend a moment on the second bullet down on page 15 about improving conversion ratios. I worked with a large cities youth program in terms of WIA, and here was the first finding. It takes 62 young people to make contact with the program before one is actually enrolled. Now, some of that may be the young person's fault, but when we analyzed the process, actually there were 6 different steps, 6 different visits that the young person had to make before they were ever actually enrolled in. We wasted customer time and staff time on 61 because only one brought results. One of the things we found is that we lost most customers at the point of TABE giving. They had decided to give the TABE test as their requirement prior to entry. Even though the rules and regulations simply say that it must be done within 60 days of enrollment, people were convinced that they needed to weed people out? Well, here's the truth for me. We spend a lot of time on creating bad community relations, lots of staff time expended on individuals that will never receive the benefit of our services. And so consequently, we have to ask, how many visits must a customer make before they begin the service? Here's the thing, maybe this is a goose gander thing that makes it really fair, but every time you waste a customer's time, you waste different steps, and we need to make sure that we eliminate as many as possible to make sure that staff and customers are not expending time. To give you a few more examples, let's talk some about waste in the training entry process. Now, we're going to be doing a full webinar on this, and actually it's the next webinar in the series on January 4th. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of these, and we'll go more in depth when we get together on January 4th. The first thing I want to just say, and I hope I can say this in a way that's useful, is that one of the things that's interesting to me, even when training budgets have been tremendously slashed across the country, the number of case managers dedicated to training customers has not necessarily been decreased. Now, it would seem to me that if our training budget has been cut by 40 to 50%, then we do not need the same number of staff people doing case management in the training program. Now, before anybody beats me up virtually, let me say this. My goal is not to lay anybody off. My question is simply, do those staff need to be redeployed to other functions in the organization so that we can cope and serve with customers? To take some of the staff who are spending their time on case management activities in a tremendously reduced training budget environment and redeploying them to more one-on-one service for people who are entering at the core level. One other item that I'd like to highlight here on this page before a couple more things on this page, is the first one is we have to ask this. This idea of having WIA orientations, is that waste? Now, yes, customers need information about training, but are we well served by having an additional step that is simply a group meeting, particularly if everyone will be following the group meeting up with a one-on-one meeting? My recommendation would be is that we immediately start service delivery at the group orientation to attempt to eliminate a step. One thing you might want to consider is to having the first meeting not being a WIA orientation. People are going to have to apply for other resources before they get WIA anyway. And moreover, much of the information on the FAFSA form would help us determine to what degree they are actually eligible for WIA financially. So we have to look at this, this practice that really is organizational lore going back to JTPA. Is WIA group orientation really most effective? The other point worth noting on this particular slide is that it is probably waste to have both paper files and electronic files. Now, I just don't want you to think I'm naive. It depends on the state you're in. It depends upon your monitoring experience. It depends upon what monitors look at. And if we have to have paper files, we do have to have paper files. But any information that can be entered only electronically, we ought to do so, because the maintenance of both paper and electronic files I got to spend time on the first one. Never has one program created so many written forms for customers to complete. The idea that we have people complete forms with data that has to be electronically entered later by staff would seem to me to be waste. Our staff need to learn to enter data in real time while conversing with a customer. This happens throughout the private sector. Think about airlines. Think about a whole range of different service provision. When people do not enter data at the same time, then sometimes it gets postponed and it never gets entered at all. So one of the things we need to think about is reducing paper forms and thinking more about how it is that staff can enter data at the same time. The third bullet down is about all of these customer activities that we require that have not necessarily ever been proven, to bring good results. This having people write essays before they enter WIA-funded training. Going to the resource area to prove that there's labor market demand for considered waste because it requires more customer visits, it requires more staff meetings, and it's one of the things you need to look at. How many things do we really need to do to ensure that customers are anchored to training? Sometimes organizations conduct exactly the same kind of assessment for training program entry that will be offered by the training provider as a prelude to entering training. We don't have time for duplicate assessments. So those are just a few thoughts as you're mapping through your training entry process. As we're thinking some about subtracting what some people might call case management waste, and again, there'll be a specific webinar on this, so we're just going to highlight some items now. This case management webinar will be held on February 8th, is that we need to examine the whole role of case management. First of all, do we have to have individual caseloads? More and more people are shifting to team caseloads with team accountability, where customers interact not with a single staff person, but they interact with the staff person who is available. Now, you remember when I said earlier that our services need to be customized and staff assisted? Well, that still needs over again. As we move to team caseload management, it permits us to share work better. It also creates a team approach to our work as opposed to just an individual performance portion of our work. Do we really need to meet with everyone monthly? By the way, the research shows that if we're talking about case managing people in training, that if in fact we can stabilize people in the school for the first couple of weeks, then they tend to make it through. So it may be more important to have more frequent intensive investment with customers during the early part of the training period, and then to begin to winnow it off over a period of time. Do all customers in training need the same intervention? Well, I would suggest to you probably not. So one of the ways we eliminate steps is to think about policies that say that every person in training will be called every month, and instead to develop criteria by which we decide who to call. Boy, we got some folks who know how to write case notes. Now, I know case notes are important. I know, in fact, that they are monitored, but you have to include the basics of who, what, and when that don't waste lots of time. Another thing we're thinking about is, can we have some case management that's not in the office at all? A lot of you do use telephone case management, but do we have the potential here for wikis and for Google Groups where we can do lots of online meetings? That's another possibility as well. So after you have done your process maps, part of the process mapping needs to look at the case management process and figuring out what we can eliminate, if anything, to make it more efficient. Another strategy that we might want to think about as we think about becoming more with less is how can we integrate our service delivery? Program silos are exceptionally expensive. We need to think some about how we form staff teams around function and not around program. In general, there are only 3 functions that I know of in your organization. There is a skills function, there's an employment function, and probably there's an employer function. We probably only need 3 teams. We do not necessarily need a dislocated worker staff, a youth staff, an adult staff. We need instead teams that focus on what, and moreover, it permits you to handle a wider group of customers because you don't have a single flow of customers into a single set of staff. So thinking some about how you organize your staff in a more integrated service method is one of the things you might want to consider. As we're talking some about staffing, I do want to talk a little bit about staffing charts and about organizational charts. We need to think about a number of things here. And as you were well aware, in the private sector for many years, and many of you as well, have begun to move toward flatter organizations. We can't afford, particularly now, to have multiple levels of supervision. We need to make sure that we reduce as much as possible the level between the front line and the leadership. The fewer the levels, the better. When you begin to reduce the levels of supervision, and you begin to, in fact, think some about flattening the organization, the second thing is that it permits better communication because it does not have to filter through so many people. And finally, and probably most importantly, it means that we have more staff for direct service delivery. What I mean by reducing the number of checkers is, oh my goodness, do we have checkers? First, the frontline staff provides the service. Then the supervisor checks to make sure that all of the data is correct. Then usually not only is there a supervisor who is a checker, there is a checker of the checkers, sort of the queen of quality assurance. And then the state comes down and checks the checker of the checkers of the checker of the checker. Well, what that means is a number of things. First of all of the time spent on checking is time that could have otherwise been expended on adding value. But moreover, it means that frontline staff have less incentive to do it right the first time. So how is it that we can improve the quality of the work without the time delays and the waste that comes from having multiple checkers? I don't know how many of you know where the word supervisor comes from, but actually it's from Victorian England. And for those of you who have ever seen The Christmas Carol, you remember Tiny Tim and Mr. Cratchit? His father worked as a bookkeeper, and he sat at a big, tall desk, and then there was one person over in the corner sitting on a very high stool with a visor, and he was considered to be the supervisor that oversaw everybody's work to make sure it got done. Well, here's the thing. We can't afford supervisors. We have to have working team leaders. And because we can't afford to have someone who just manages the work, they have to pitch in with the work. They need to be full team members and not just supervisors. If you are a local workforce board that contracts out for functions, one of the things that contracts out for services, one of the things you need to look at is how many functions mirror the functions of the board staff within the contractor. Do we really need the equation? More and more, we need to think about what in lean manufacture we would call supplier partnerships. And what that simply means is that we should eliminate duplicative functions, attempt to centralize them wherever we can, and to unify them so that we're not expending resources in two places for exactly the same function. And by the way, when the contractor and the board has the same functions, oftentimes, most of the time, is spent on arguing over whose numbers are right and a whole range of different kinds of discussions. So that's another area that we need to think about. Can we really truly afford it? And as we talked about earlier, it's important to integrate service functions and to think some about how it is we can organize our staff not by program, but by service. So as we think some about updating our services, and I think I've mentioned most of these, but just as a summary, I think we need to ask, can we move to more one-on-one? And if we redeploy staff from functions that are loaded with waste, can we actually do more one-on-one? Most of us offer workshops. Well, I'm going to tell you, having fewer, better workshops offered more frequently is one of the ways to make our business services. Now, I make a distinction between business services and employer services. Business services is this wider range of activities about how we help businesses. Employer services is about how we help employers find job candidates and how we help our job seekers find jobs. One of the things we need to think about is for that employer function team is what do they spend their time on? The question is not how many of them do we have, but where do they give priority? For me, there are three primary priorities for the employer team. They need to get job listings that are appropriate for the customers that we serve. They need to work on OJT because that is a direct connection service that brings job seekers and employers together, and they need to spend time on ensuring we have hiring events with employers in our centers. It's not that all of the other things they do are wasteful. It is simply in a time of limited resources, we must cut back. Is a big movement around the country, which is moving to non-physical facility related service delivery. As you are probably aware, one of the huge discussions that's going on maybe in Illinois, but at least across the country, is how can we reduce infrastructure costs? How can we reduce the amount of dollars that we expend on facilities, on facility maintenance? And so one of the things that we need to talk about is how can we, in fact, increase access while reducing infrastructure costs? If you're from a rural area and every county has its own center, well, that's probably politically necessary. It is also exceptionally costly. The truth is what customers care about is can they get the service easily, not necessarily where the service is being delivered from. I'd like to share with you something my friends in Southeast Texas are doing. They have another team, and they actually call it the Regional Solutions Team. And what the Regional Solutions Team does is they serve customers not in center locations. It is a combination of web access, phone access, and mobile mobile labs. What's interesting, though, is a lot of places have them, but they don't have them on a regular route. And again, this is another one of those ways you know exactly how old I am. But I remember when the bookmobile used to come to the corner of Bishop Avenue every Wednesday. It was the highlight of my life. I do know this, though, that I expected them every Wednesday. So the mobile van is not just for special events. It's for a regular circuit riding to ensure that it is over a wide range of location. So one of the things that you might want to think about is who's responsible for service delivery that is not center based. And I think this will become increasingly important in the future. Almost everyone has a website, but in most cases, the website is just to inform and to promote and not actually to serve. My friends in Southeast Texas has a real-time chat function. People provide Google Groups where people can be case managed virtually and electronically. So we need to move beyond websites as promotional devices to service devices. And I would urge you to think about who's responsible for that, or do we assume that everybody will come into the office? And so, as we're thinking some about this, I think that it feeds into the next discussion, which is on economies of scale. And actually, there's two countervailing trends that's happening around the country. What I refer to as micro centers and mega centers. And in the case of micro centers, this is what people are doing to deal with the infrastructure costs. They are actually increasing the number of service locations, but having smaller service locations. In some places, they're creating mega centers, closing all of the centers in the area but one and moving everybody under a single roof. As we begin to think about increasing service delivery and increasing service access while reducing infrastructure costs, I hope you will consider a microcenter strategy and to not just consider a mega. Has lots of experience that says that when people come to smaller centers, they tend to be served in a very different kind of way. Staff are more collegial, and staff are more likely to work together as an integrated service team. So it's really funny. Back in the early days of WIA in 1998, the question was, how could we get everyone to move into a building? Well, the microcenter strategy says maybe they don't move in with us, but we begin to move in with them. We move into libraries. I know that this is an off-the-wall fantasy, but I'm just waiting for the one-stop center that's co-located like a Starbucks in Walmart. We need to think some about where the customers are and how we can. Regardless of how many centers we have, we need to think something about alternative ways to deliver services. So Steve, I think we have a poll question here on multiple service delivery. Can you share that with us so we can see what people are doing? Because I'm sure you do a lot of these things. Let's see, and you get to check all of these that apply. If you have a mobile van, check that box. If you currently are using call centers, and by that I mean people not just calling into to staff, but a specific way to do call centers, that would be interesting. Can people actually access and receive services on the web as opposed to just learn about them? Wow, the social media thing's really happening. We're Twittering up a storm and Facebooking. Boy, it looks like people have moved to good web things. I love this outstationing. You know, I wish we wouldn't think of it as outstationing, but we would think of those locations is really a service delivery outlet. The concept of comprehensive centers and satellite centers is so yesterday. We need to think of every location as a valuable location that serves customers. So it looks like social media is really on the rise. That really, and this is impressive, slightly over 1/2 of you are using web access and delivery, and I think we need to do even more of that. It looks like call centers has not been your approach. It's only one. And only one place has a mobile van. Well, that's something worth thinking about. So it looks like people are using alternative strategies, and we probably need to continue. I just noticed in the chat bars that we're not Facebooking, we're just emailing. Well, emailing is cool too. I will share with you, though, this issue of wikis. Everybody know what that is? A wiki is basically a shared interactive website where everybody can participate. Is another way to think about that. You can go on Google and form your own group. That's another way to think about that as well. So we're going to have to continue to think about alternative service delivery that's not just center-based. So what we've done very, very rapidly is to begin to go through and what your thoughts are. Certainly, if you have any questions, that's fine too. But I've covered an awful lot of material very rapidly. But I would love to hear from you. What are some of the things that you thought were most important? So let me just do a quick poll. Then we're going to open up the chat function, and we'll begin to have a discussion here for the remainder of our time. The next poll, Steve, is to ask people, where did they get some ideas here? So if we can just put that poll right up here and see, we talked some about redesigning and redeploying resources. We talked about efficiencies and subtraction. We talked some about technology and integration and about creating economies of scale. Who found what useful? And you can check more than one. Still got the results coming in here. Oh boy, these results make an old presenter's heart beat. Looks like a lot of people found a lot of things useful. I'm really happy about that. Still got some results coming in. Okay, well that's pretty good results. It looks like 3/4 of you, found the first two particularly useful, although it looks like increasing technology and integration was important as well. So I think that's great. And by the way, frontline staff always like this idea of subtraction. It's just don't forget the New York story because breaking up's hard to do. But you can't subtract individually. That's something the organization as a whole has to do. So let's close this poll, Steve. Anything that you'd like to learn about what others are doing about certain situations. So just please use your chat function and type in anything that will be important for you here. Looks like Danita's getting something in here. As people are collecting their thoughts, remember I said that we were going to be doing our next webinar on streamlining training entry, and we're going to be doing a session on case management. As we design those sessions, any of your feedback or specific things that you'd like to discuss, that would be great. Let's see. Danita says, I would like to know about interactive online applications as an option. I am comfortable using Twitter and Facebook, but I think that it would be more beneficial if we had a link to the actual application. Are there online WI applications I can view through another office? Well, actually, the ones that I've seen, Danita, and this may or may not be useful, and I'll try to make sure I include a specific link when we get together in January. But what people basically do now is they take the exact same application that they would be using in the office, and they simply make it about the 3 features of employer services, and that the audio cut out. I'm sorry about that. Here's the 3 things for me. We need to get jobs that can be filled by our center customers. Not just the number, not just more job orders, but more jobs that fit our customers. We need to make sure that our employer staff are looking for jobs that fit where people are going to school. If you're sending a lot of people to truck driving school, then they should be getting a lot of truck driving jobs, for example. So the first thing is for the employer team is to get more jobs that are specific to our center and program customers. The second thing is on-the-job training, because that's a direct connection between employers and job seekers. It helps our performance standards and it achieves customer perceived value. And the third thing is hosting more in-center and or in-office hiring events where employers come and interview pre-screened applicants that we have screened for the purpose of hiring. All of those 3 are what I would call direct connection services. Things like incumbent worker training, things like workforce intelligence and talent pipeline mapping. I think every one of those is important, and those very well may be functions of the board staff. But for the staff that works with the service delivery, they need to be focused on our center customers and how we connect them directly to the labor market, just simply because we don't have enough resources to do all of the good things that would need to be done. So, Lisa, that's the third item. Other comments or thoughts or things that you've done to cope? I noticed that in the first survey poll that a number of you said that you had changed policies and procedures and had streamlined activities as a result of budget reduction. If anybody could share those with us, that would be great. There was also some of you that said that you were had other ways that you reduced costs besides the reduction of staff and facilities. I'd love to hear those too. So anything you can share on that, that would be great. Looks like Amy's typing in here. Here. Okay, let's see. Do you have any suggestions to getting around the way we have always done it mentality? Boy, I would be a major therapist if I could do that, wouldn't here's the thing. I don't know who it is specifically believes that we have to always do it that way. I will tell. No, I hope this isn't too cynical, but I will tell you something that I've observed. Have you ever noticed that for a lot of staff, the staff who most do not like their jobs are the ones who don't want to change a thing? See, for me, if you don't like it, you would be the person who most wants to change it. I think that I would make the following suggestions. I am a big believer in convening all staff, not at frontline and leadership level, but leadership frontline work groups to get together to map processes. I think when you map the process explicitly, that opens people's mindset to change. I think also sometimes people don't want to change because they know something we don't know. And so sometimes you have to be very respectful when people raise objections. And the way I always look at it is that it's important. I think also with any major process change or policy change, there needs to be a pilot period. There needs to be a transition period where people can test whether or not it works. That's the reason why really in lean manufacturing, you never call it best practices, but you call it promising practices because the results are what counts. So sometimes you can get people to test it without adopting it completely. Um, but I do think that getting staff together in these hard times sometimes opens us to change that we could not otherwise accomplish. So I don't know. I don't know if any of that's useful, but that's at least a few ideas. Anybody else have anything they want to bring up here? Do me one favor, and this will be. Looks like Joshua's typing something. They're using a scanner. All documentation in some local areas are scanned into the computer. And that means that we don't have to have paper files all around the office and all of those kinds of things. So what I really like about that is even if we're required to have paper files, there's an electronic method to do that because just the quantity of paper, and I'm not even talking about from an ecology perspective, but I think the quantity of paper is overwhelming for us. And so I think that's a great idea, Joshua, and I'm glad you've done that. That's an excellent idea. How about other people, what you've been doing? Anything else? Looks like Joanne's typing in here. Just giving Joanne a moment to get her comment in. Looks like Kathy with an I is beginning to get something in too. Oh my goodness, it's uh, I hope that means that they've been doing some subtraction and reduction. Oh, that's good. So it sort of sounds like people have gone on a policy diet. That's a good thing. All right, do me one more thing, and you're certainly welcome to put in more comments and or things you'd like to discuss. But this would be exceptionally useful, I know, to the Illinois Workforce Partnership and to the Illinois Employment and Training Association and to myself. But if you would just take a moment, and I'd love to hear, what are the ideas that were best for you today? What's your takeaways? If you could just list some of your takeaways, that would be really great. Because I know I covered a lot of things, and some may have been useful, some may have not. But what are some of the things that you thought were important? And they may be things that you were already doing that was reinforced. But let's just make a best list, a best bet list, so we can all leave here with some idea of what counted for everyone. I like the online chat options too, Mike. Eliminating silos and moving to team case management. Boy, I think we've got to do that. You can't have people with caseloads of 300. Getting staff together to process map, I think that's excellent. Because when all the staff gets together and works on it, everybody owns it together. By the way, if everyone's involved in process mapping, you don't have to train because everybody created it. Yeah. Implementing team approach, eliminating waste. Don't forget, you can't add value until you eliminate waste. Looks like Cindy liked the mapping process too. That's good. Susan, you want to move away from some of the silos to those 3 key functions of our organizations. That's a good one. A lot of people typing in now. That's good. Other integration of services there. Got more ideas coming in. Yes, using the website as a service delivery tool. Right. The resource area, absolutely. I believe every customer deserves the dignity of a brief one-on-one meeting with someone to get them started on our services. Yeah. Not just to have one center, but to increase access through many micro centers, moving to non-center based way of delivering services. I like this one a lot, Lorraine. Finding out what the customer perceives as value. Because quick service is important, but service that has meaning is even more important. Boy, I'm worried about the burnout of the resource room too. That's the reason why I want to redeploy staff to where the customers are. And I think you're right on that. We need to somehow get customer staff out of the land of cubicles and up front to where the customers are, or else get the customers up front back to the staff in the cubicles. Traction focus. That's absolutely right. See, Brenda and Susan's getting something in here. Let's see. Yes, this whole issue of triaging and realizing that not all customers need the same amount. So our policy has to be written in a way that that talks about what to apply, what policy to whom when, as opposed to just that easy way of everyone all of the time. Brenda liked the 3 functions. I'm glad you liked that. Got time for just a couple more thoughts here. Looks like Susan's putting something in. David's got something going in. Yeah, I think recruiting teens through social media, and I just would add one thing, David, and you probably mean this too. I don't want to just talk about recruiting teens. I want to talk about serving teens using social media. Social media as a method from which people can network for jobs is certainly on the rise, and we need to be a part of that conversation. So I think that's really good too. Boy, we got lots of people with comments. Boy, I hope it was useful for people, because it looks like a lot of people are taking at least one or two things as a takeaway, and that's really, really good. Lorraine agrees with Susan. That's a good thing. All right. Do me a favor if you don't mind. Would you mind showing your hands if you got at least one thing that you have as a takeaway from this session? Get to see whether people did have some takeaways. Well, I really appreciate it. Look at that. We got some hands going here, and that's great. Well, I'm glad you got at least a couple of things. I truly am. What I hope you'll do as a result of this webinar is that you'll get together with immediately with other people in your organization and say, what was our takeaways? What are we going to do next? We don't have time to waste because we have too much waste to eliminate. And I hope that each and every one of you will enjoy today's seminar and will join us in these upcoming webinars. And you'll be more than welcome to come. You'll notice my email address is below. If you wish to email me and to let me know about some of the topics you'd like to specifically discuss, that and Illinois WorkNet giving me the opportunity to work with you today. I wish you only continued success, wonderful holidays, and I'll see you on January 4th. Thank you so much for coming.